All right, let's talk about something I think we've all experienced. I mean, who hasn't had to deal with local anesthesia at some point, right?
Oh, absolutely. Whether it's at the dentist or for a minor procedure, it's pretty much a staple of modern medicine.
Yeah, and it's kind of amazing when you think about it. Little shot, and suddenly, boom,
Yeah.
numbness, pain managed. But I have to admit, I never really stopped to think about what's actually happening at the, cellular level. How is it that we can just shut off pain sensations in such a specific way?
Right. It's one of those things that's easy to take for granted because it works so well. But the science behind it, the way these local anesthetics interact with our nerves, it's incredibly fascinating.
So that's exactly what we're going to unpack in this deep dive.
Exactly. We're gonna really delve into the core mechanisms of how local anesthesia works, and we're basing this on some pretty amazing source material.
Yeah. And, the sources you've pulled together this time are really focused, which I love. It's all about the nitty-gritty physiology, the nuts and bolts of how these drugs actually do their thing in the body.
Yeah, no fluff, just pure science. We're talking about how these substances create that temporary loss of sensation in a localized area by directly interacting with nerve function.
Okay, so before we get into the how, let's start with the what. In the simplest terms, what is local anesthesia actually doing? What's the big picture effect on our bodies?
Well, at its most basic level, local anesthesia results in a loss of feeling in a very specific targeted area. And this happens in one of two ways. It can either sort of quiet down the activity of the nerve endings themselves, those tiny sensors that pick up on things like pressure or temperature change.
Right.
Or, and this is more common, it blocks the signals that are traveling along the peripheral nerves. Those pathways that relay information from the body to the brain.
That's like hitting the mute button on pain, but in a very precise location.
Exactly. Think of it like setting up a chemical roadblock. These local anesthetics step in and basically stop the pain signals from reaching your brain.
Okay, that's a great analogy. So if
Yeah.
we're building a roadblock, we need to understand the
Yeah.
traffic patterns, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does nerve impulse transmission look like in a normal, non-anesthetized state?
Absolutely. So picture this. You have a nerve, and it's essentially acting like a communication cable. But instead of electricity flowing through metal wires, it's more like a cascade of chemical and electrical changes happening across the nerve cell membrane.
Right.
Now, some of these cables, so to speak, they have this special insulating wrapping around them. It's called the myelin sheath. Kind of like the insulation around an electrical wire, and this myelin sheath has these periodic gaps in it called nodes of Ranvier.
And I remember from, previous deep dives that this myelin sheath is what allows nerve impulses to travel so quickly.
Yeah, you got it. It's all about speed. Because myelin is such a good insulator, it allows those myelinated nerves to transmit impulses way faster than unmyelinated nerves of the same size.
So it's like the express lane versus, local roads.
Yeah, exactly. With unmyelinated nerves, the impulse has to travel as a continuous kind of wave-like process along the entire length of the nerve fiber. It's a much slower, I guess you could call it a creeping process. But with myelinated nerves, the impulse can essentially jump from one node of Ranvier to the next.
Right, I remember this. Saltatory conduction.
That's it, saltatory conduction. And it makes signal transmission so much more efficient.
So we've got these nerve fibers, some with a myel express lane, some without. But how does the message itself, the nerve impulse, actually get started and move along the nerve?
So this is where it gets really cool. It all starts with some kind of stimulation, right? Could be pressure, could be a change in temperature, something that excites the nerve. And this initial excitation causes what we call a slow depolarization of the nerve cell membrane.
Depolarization. Now that's a word I haven't heard in a while.
It's a fundamental concept in neurophysiology. Basically, think of it this way. In its resting state, a nerve cell has a certain electrical charge across its membrane. The inside is more negative compared to the outside. This difference in charge is called the membrane potential.
Right, okay.
So when a nerve gets stimulated, this electrical balance starts to shift. The inside of the cell becomes a little bit less negative. It's like a gradual tilting of the scales.
I'm with you. So what happens when the scales tip far enough?
Well, if this gradual depolarization reaches a certain critical point, what we call the threshold potential or firing threshold, it triggers a much more rapid and dramatic phase of depolarization.
Okay, so this threshold is like the tipping point.
Exactly. Once it's reached, there's no turning back. It sets off a chain reaction. You get this sudden and complete reversal of the electrical potential across the nerve membrane. The inside of the cell actually becomes electrically positive relative to the outside. It swings all the way up to about plus 40 millivolts. And that sudden flip, that's the action potential, the nerve impulse itself.
Wow, so it's like a complete electrical switcheroo. And then what?
Well, this state of depolarization, it's not permanent. It's a very brief event. And after the peak, the nerve cell goes through a process called repolarization.
Okay, so back to the original state.
Right. The electrical potential inside the nerve starts to gradually return to its more negative resting value. Eventually, it settles back down to around negative 70 millivolts.
So it's a cycle, stable, slight nudge, big flip, then back to stable. I like it. Now, I know that ions, those charged particles, are involved in all of this electrical activity. But can you remind me how they fit into the picture?
Oh, absolutely. They are the key players. They're the ones driving these electrical changes. See, in its resting state, the nerve cell membrane has a very specific permeability to different ions. Think of it like a gatekeeper, allowing some ions to pass through more easily than others.
Right. Okay.
And in the resting state, the membrane is only slightly permeable to sodium ions, Na+, but it's much more permeable to potassium ions, K+, and chloride ions, Cl.
So sodium is kind of stuck outside, while potassium and chloride have more freedom to move around.
Exactly. Now, when a nerve segment gets stimulated and starts to depolarize, something interesting happens. There's a sudden increase in the permeability of the cell membrane, specifically to sodium ions. It's like those gates for sodium suddenly swing wide open.
And what happens then?
Well, you get this rapid influx of sodium ions rushing into the interior of the nerve cell. And since sodium ions have a positive charge, this influx causes the membrane potential to become even less negative, driving it up towards that firing threshold. Typically, that threshold sits around megavolts 50 to megavolts 60 millivolts. So it only takes a decrease of about 15 millivolts from the resting potential to trigger this whole cascade.
So it's like, pushing a swing, you need to push it just hard enough to get it going.
Perfect analogy. And after the peak of depolarization, we need a way to bring the action potential to an end. This happens during repolarization. And it's triggered by a couple of things. First, those open sodium channels, they start to close up or inactivate.
Okay, so sodium can't rush in anymore.
Right. And at the same time, the permeability to potassium ions increases even further. So potassium starts flowing out of the cell.
And because potassium is also positively charged, that outward flow helps to bring the membrane potential back down to its resting state.
You got it. And this whole process is incredibly fast, happening in a matter of milliseconds.
And what about those refractory periods we were talking about before? How do they fit into all of this?
They're crucial for making sure that the nerve impulses travel in the right direction and with the proper timing. See, after an action potential, there's this brief period called the absolute refractory period. During this time, the nerve is basically unresponsive. You could hit it with the strongest stimulus imaginable, and it won't fire another action potential. It's like it needs a moment to catch its breath.
Okay, so it's a hard reset.
Right. And then, following that, there's a relative refractory period. During this period, a new impulse can be generated, but it takes a stronger than usual stimulus to do it.
So it's like the nerve is a little sluggish, still recovering from the last impulse.
Exactly. And these refractory periods are important because they prevent the signal from traveling backwards along the nerve fiber. They ensure that each impulse is a discrete event moving in one direction.
All right, so that's the before picture, the normal nerve impulse process with all its electrical ups and downs, ions flowing in and out. But now let's introduce the local anesthetic. How does it disrupt this whole system? What's the during picture look like?
So the main way that local anesthetics work is by specifically messing with those voltage-gated sodium channels. They actually decrease the permeability of these channels to sodium ions. It's like they put a chemical plug right in the doorway, preventing sodium from rushing into the nerve cell.
So if sodium can't get in, what happens to that whole depolarization process?
Well, without that rapid influx of positive sodium ions, the nerve membrane can't reach that critical firing threshold. It stays polarized, stuck in its resting state. And that rapid depolarization, the action potential, it just doesn't happen.
So the chemical roadblock is basically a bunch of jammed sodium gates. I like it.
That's a great way to put it. And without those action potentials, the local electrical currents that normally propagate the impulse along the nerve fiber, they don't develop either. So the signal hits a dead end. That's why we call it a non-depolarizing nerve block.
Okay, so the anesthetic is essentially stopping the domino effect.
Yeah.
No initial flip, no cascade.
Precisely. Now, let's talk about why some local anesthetics might have different effects, like why some last longer or work faster than others. This comes down to their chemical properties.
Right, I was wondering about that because I remember seeing something about how local anesthetics are actually salts, and they exist in different forms depending on the pH level. Took me back to my chemistry days.
Ah, yes. pH and pKa. These are key concepts. It might seem a little technical, but bear with me. It's essential for understanding how these drugs work. So you're right, local anesthetics are salts. And when they're dissolved in a solution, like the kind that gets injected, they exist in this dynamic equilibrium between two forms. There's an uncharged molecule called the free base, Rn, and a positively charged molecule called the carcation, RNH+.
So it's like they can switch back and forth between these two states.
Exactly. And what determines the balance between these two forms is the pH of the solution and the surrounding tissues. The pH, as you might recall, is a measure of acidity or alkalinity.
Right, right, the pH scale.
Exactly. So in a more acidic environment, which means a lower pH, more of the anesthetic molecules will be in that positively charged cationic form, RNH+. And in a more alkaline environment, which means a higher pH, the equilibrium shifts towards the uncharged free base form, Rn.
Okay, so pH is really important here. But what about pK? I remember that term being thrown around too.
pK is another crucial factor. It basically tells us how strongly a molecule holds on to hydrogen ions, H+. You can think of it as a measure of the molecule's preference for being in its charged or uncharged state at a given pH.
So a high pK means it really wants to hold on to those hydrogen ions.
Yeah, you could say that. And here's the key point. When the pH of the solution is exactly equal to the pKa of the local anesthetic, you'll have a 50-50 split. Half of the drug will be in the free base form, Rn, and half will be in the cationic form, RNH+.
Interesting. So why does all of this matter for actually blocking a nerve? I mean, do these two forms have different roles to play?
They absolutely do. The uncharged free base form, Rn, is what we call lipid soluble. That means it can dissolve easily in fats and oils. And this is really important because the outer layer of the nerve fiber, the nerve sheath, is quite fatty.
So the free base is kind of like the key that unlocks the door to the nerve.
Perfect analogy. The free base is responsible for diffusing through that fatty nerve sheath and reaching the nerve membrane itself. But here's the thing. A local anesthetic with a high pKa, meaning it's closer to the body's pH of 7.4, will have fewer free base molecules available at that physiological pH.
So it takes longer for the numbing to kick in.
Exactly, because there are fewer of those free base keys to unlock the door to the nerve. On the other hand, a local anesthetic with a really low pK, maybe below 7.5, will have a larger proportion of those lipid-soluble free base molecules, so it might diffuse more quickly, potentially leading to a faster onset.
So lower pKa, faster numbing. Got it. But there must be a catch, right?
There is. Because while the free base is great at getting the drug to the nerve, it's actually the positively charged cationic form, RNH+, that's believed to be the one that actually binds to the receptor site on the sodium channel and blocks the entry of sodium ions.
Ah, I see. So you need the free base to get through the door, but then you need some of it to switch to the cationic form to actually do the blocking inside.
Precisely. And this also helps explain why local anesthetics sometimes don't work as well in tissues that are inflamed or infected.
Because inflammation changes the pH.
Right. Inflamed tissues tend to have a lower pH, meaning they're more acidic. And this lower pH favors the formation of the cationic form outside the nerve. And while this is the form that actually blocks the channel, it's less able to diffuse through the nerve sheath because it's not as lipid soluble as the free base. So it's like having the right key but not being able to get it into the lock.
That makes total sense. And I guess the increased blood flow in inflamed tissues doesn't help either, right?
Yeah, it can wash the anesthetic away more quickly, so you get a lower concentration at the nerve.
Wow. So the journey of the anesthetic from the injection site to actually blocking the nerve is quite an adventure. It's like a delicate dance of chemical properties and tissue environment. Can you walk us through the steps of that journey?
Absolutely. So once the local anesthetic is injected, it doesn't just sit there. It starts to spread out in all directions. It diffuses from an area of high concentration right at the injection site to areas of lower concentration further away.
It's like dropping food coloring into water.
Right.
It spreads out gradually.
Perfect analogy. So some of the anesthetic molecules will diffuse towards the nerve itself, but a significant portion will also diffuse away into the surrounding tissues and blood vessels.
So not all of the injected anesthetic actually reaches the nerve.
Right. And that's why the initial concentration of the anesthetic solution is so important. A higher concentration creates a steeper gradient, a bigger difference between the injection site and the nerve. And that drives faster diffusion, leading to a quicker onset of numbness.
Makes sense. And I remember reading something about how nerve fibers are organized into these bundles called mantle and core bundles. How does that affect things?
Ah, yes. That's another key factor. Imagine a nerve as being made up of many smaller bundles of individual nerve fibers, all bundled together like a cable. The mantle bundles are the nerve fibers located on the outer part of this larger structure, so they're the first ones to be exposed to the anesthetic after it's injected, and they get hit with the highest concentration.
So they get numbed faster.
Exactly. The mantle bundles are usually blocked more completely and quickly. The core bundles, on the other hand, are located deeper inside the nerve, so the anesthetic has to travel further to reach them.
So they get numbed later, if at all.
Right, and because the concentration of the anesthetic is usually lower by the time it reaches the core bundles, they might not be blocked as effectively. And this difference in location explains why the effects of local anesthesia sometimes seem to wear off in a specific pattern as the drug diffuses away from the core bundles first.
So the arrangement of the nerve fibers within the bundle actually influences how quickly and how well they're anesthetized. That's fascinating.
It is, and it has real implications for how clinicians administer local anesthetics to make sure they achieve the desired level and duration of numbness.
This has been an incredibly insightful look into the world of local anesthesia. It's amazing to think that all of this is happening at a microscopic level, just to prevent us from feeling pain during routine procedures.
It really is a testament to the complexity and elegance of our biology.
So to recap, local anesthetics work their magic by blocking nerve impulses. And they primarily do this by reducing the permeability of those voltage-gated sodium channels in the nerve membrane, preventing the nerve from firing. And how effective a particular anesthetic is depends a lot on its chemical properties, especially its pKa, which determines how it exists in its charged and uncharged forms at different pH levels.
Right. The free base form is crucial for getting the drug across that fatty nerve sheath to reach the nerve membrane, while the cationic form is the one that actually binds to the sodium channel and blocks it.
And then you have the whole journey of the anesthetic from the injection site to the nerve, the way it diffuses and spreads out. And the internal organization of the nerve, with its mantle and core bundles, also plays a role. It's a really intricate interplay of factors.
It really is. It's a beautiful example of how diffusion, chemical equilibrium, and cellular mechanisms all work together.
It makes you wonder, if we can manipulate these processes with such precision to block pain, what other biological processes might we be able to target in a similar way? What kind of medical breakthroughs might be possible if we could harness this level of control and specificity? It's definitely something to ponder.
Yeah.
Anyway, this has been an absolutely fantastic deep dive. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us.
It was my pleasure. Always happy to talk about the wonders of neuroscience.